Welcome, it's us, your friendly neighborhood apostates, here to help you a little bit if you're going through a faith crisis or you realize that you're leaving the Mormon church. We get a lot of people saying we should make a video like this, and even though it's something we have talked about a little bit, we thought let's make a video specifically about it and kind of just tell you a little bit of what you can probably expect as you're navigating leaving a high demand religion like Mormonism, what we've learned from our experiences, mistakes we don't want you to make that we might have made, and so on.
What to expect when you're expecting damnation.
Zelph.
On the shelf. First of all, let's say the leaving any high demand religion, the LDS Church in this case specifically, is such a difficult event. There's no right way to do it. You don't need to feel like, oh, I'm the loser who can't get my shit together, or, you know, whatever it is. You just need to, a lot of times, just feel what you're feeling, and the faith transition comes with a lot of feelings.
Yeah, it's hard because you've been taught your whole life, you know, not to become an ex-mormon, for example, and that is the worst thing in the world that you could become. And then you're also taught these ideas of what an ex-mormon looks like, or what like causes people to leave the church, and a lot of time people realize, you know, that doesn't align with my experience. So you're kind of fighting two battles, which is like navigating your own experience, and then also the fact that everyone in the church that you're navigating with has a inbuilt different perspective of what your experience is. No matter what you say, they're coming to the table with a preconceived idea of kind of who you are, or like, you know, these ideas like maybe you wanted to sin, maybe you were lazy, whatever it is. It's a big thing to navigate because you're not given any protocol for dealing with it because you've been taught your whole life that it's the worst thing that you can do. So go easy on yourself is like a message we want to share with you. Like, there is no blueprint for leaving a church. All we can do is try and give you the best advice we have. Yeah.
Something more about feelings is not only have you been conditioned to think a certain way about leaving the church, but also about your feelings just generally. Because in the LDS paradigm, some of your thoughts are from God, some of them are from you, some are from the devil. So you're taught to, you know, suppress various thoughts and, you know, cling to other ones. And if you're thinking certain things, you're bad or you're broken or whatever. When in fact our feelings just come and go, and we experience a whole range of thoughts and feelings, and rather than feeling like we need to be feeling a certain way, you can just kind of learn to accept what it is that you're feeling and say, it's okay that right now I feel angry, or that right now I feel lonely, or that right now I feel anxious or devastated, or any of the things. You don't have to feel like you need to get to a place where you're happy, because I think the more that time goes on, you see that like happiness and sadness, joy and pain, you know, all those things really do go hand in hand, and it's about learning to just accept and roll with the seasons of your life, which I think is a much more healthy perspective than being like the always skeptical of your own thoughts and feelings and trying to hide from them and things.
Yeah, Mormonism teaches you to identify a lot with your thoughts and your feelings, and to kind of assign a moral value to them. So, you know, if you're having a certain type of doubts about the church, then maybe Mormons might teach that that's indicative that you're not being faithful enough in various ways, stuff like that. The reality is that your thoughts and your feelings, like everything you are, you know, the product of the things you're experiencing and have experienced in the past, your conditioning, all these things, you know, this interplay of factors. And so you don't want to be assigning, you know, moral judgments to the way that you're thinking or feeling, especially because leaving a high demand religion generally requires you to go through an actual grieving process. You go through the stages of grief because it's so huge for your brain to lose its entire framework for existence and, you know, its worldview, its lens through which it sees the world. That is traumatizing for the brain, and your brain is really scrambling when you lose that. And so there's going to be a lot of like thoughts and feelings you're having that won't necessarily make sense to you, won't fit into like this neat box, won't always be convenient, might come out at weird times. You know, there's going to be a lot going on, and that we can't be your therapists. Getting a therapist is actually probably a really good idea.
Go to therapy. Everyone should be in therapy.
But whether or not you have a therapist, like the main message we want to give you is that your thoughts and your feelings are okay. They are valid, whatever they are, and you get to now observe them without completely identifying with them, which is very powerful. It's a big principle of mindfulness, which we kind of talk about a lot. The power of just observing your thoughts and feelings rather than, you know, if you're experiencing anxiety, being like, I am anxious, and then maybe even going further than that and being like, and I am doing something wrong because I'm anxious. And, you know, it doesn't need to be like that. You can just observe that you're feeling some anxiety, observe what the sensations feel like in your body, stuff like that, rather than being so taken in by them. And also, as with all grieving, it does get better with time, but you can't rush that process. Your brain, however cognitively you may have worked through, you know, your ideas about the church, your thoughts and feelings, it's not as simple as that in reality, because you've been in this thing for so long, it meant so much to you, and we're not always in control of, like, you know, that grieving sucks because we're kind of not in control. We just have to ride it out.
I want to add too that Mormon culture, and I think it's a human thing. I don't want to say like Mormons are the only ones who do this, but I have noticed it a lot in Mormon culture that it's a lot about appearances. And so, you know, there's a lot of people who are trying to self-present as, you know, our life is perfectly put together. I have the perfect Mormon family, the perfect job as a dentist, the perfect smoking hot trophy wife who's going to give me perfect sex for the rest
Once a month.
Yeah, right? Like, you know, we've got our perfectly manicured lawn, and we show up to church in matching dresses and ties every Sunday. We got our shit together. And then you leave the church and your world is topsy-turvy and things feel like they're falling apart. And I have felt a ton of pressure to still act like I've got it all together, I've got all the answers. And I think having a YouTube or, you know, internet presence feels that way too, that like, you know, I have to act like, okay, like you know, there's hope and things. And the truth is that I have times of like, of confusion and distress and anxiety and depression. And
as all humans do.
Right, we all do. And it's not like I didn't have them before. I had them before, but I was trying to pretend that I didn't.
Yeah.
And because I was trying to pretend that I was wasn't hurting, I was just creating, like, perpetuating the cycle of pain.
Yeah, what you resist persists.
Exactly, yeah. So, you know, the people who say, you know, anger is one that Mormons love to target, or Latter-day Saints love to target about people who leave the church, is, they're so, you know, bitter and angry. And it's like, yes, they're experiencing anger because anger comes from a place of deep hurt.
Yeah.
So when you see anger, you should see that as a person who is hurting profoundly. But because and if you feel like, I'm not allowed to be angry, which is what Mormons feel, instead of, they bottle it up and then they channel it out, they run from the idea of themselves as an angry person, and then they just transfer the pain to somebody else.
And it comes out in more unhealthy ways. You can't just make an emotion vanish. There are things you can do to allow kind of the anger emotion to play out in your body kind of as healthily and quickly as possible. And on what that looks like is just allowing it to be there. And I do think there are ways you can not add fuel to the fire. Like, one thing I wish is that when I left the church, I was, you know, a bit more private in how I expressed my anger. I definitely, you know, going from being a Mormon blogger, I really wanted to get all this anger out publicly. And there were ways that was valuable, and then there were ways that it wasn't. I think something that can add to the anger is feeling like you have to justify yourself to people, and I think it's really important to understand that you don't. There is a high chance that some of the people, or maybe even a lot of the people that are faithful that you're trying to explain your situation to, they're not interested in fully understanding your perspective because it threatens theirs. And so you kind of just have to become okay with that and not be prepared for that, rather than feeling like, I mean, you probably will feel frustrated when that happens, but know that it's going to happen so you can be a bit more prepared and not, you know, like I said, I kind of gave in to my anger too much in certain times, and I think I acted unwisely. And it's fine, I forgive myself, that's the place I was in. You can only do your best at the time. But yeah, find healthy internal coping mechanisms.
Save it for your art.
Channel it all through your art.
Really though, you know, try your hand at creating whatever it is. Like, everyone I feel like creativity is sort of an innate drive.
Yeah, and they've shown that writing out our experiences does help our brains to organize them and process them better. So writing about your experiences, you know, not necessarily publicly, but that can be really valuable.
Yeah, if you want to do it publicly too, that's great.
Yeah,
like, it helps to have more perspective and more information being shared. I think you just highlighted probably the hardest part of the Mormon faith transition is knowing that no matter what, people are not going to be able to understand. You've come from this really tight-knit, close community that is now like treating you like pariah, refuses to understand where you're coming from, validate your experience in any way, and that's just tough.
Yeah.
So
I think you have to try and develop kind of a Zen mindset about it and recognize that people can only be where they're at, And even though it feels so personal, because it's almost like you finding out that this depth of connection you thought you had with people isn't as strong as you hoped it would be, because, you know, in this hour of need when you need them, they are maybe rejecting you, or, you know, mischaracterizing you, or have these assumptions about who you are that aren't true.
Or sometimes at best just like unwilling to burden. I know there's people who love me very deeply and would love to help me, but just like
they don't
can't take upon the burden of like walking in my shoes, you know, reading the things I've read, thinking about the thoughts.
And you can't force people to do that, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I don't know. Another thing I wanted to mention that I don't really have a personal experience with, but we get a lot of comments from people who have experienced this, which is even after you've realized that Mormonism isn't true, your brain will still sometimes go back and be like, but what if it is true? Or like, what if I'm making a huge mistake? That's really normal for people leaving high demand religions. I just want to tell you that in advance or now, so that when it happens, it's not surprising and you don't, like, you know, let your old Mormon conditioning come back up and be like, that's the spirit or whatever. It's really normal. When your brain has been used to a certain framework for potentially decades of your life, very normal for it to revert back to that. Because, like, your cognitive understanding of what's happening and your brain's like coping mechanisms and like what it's going through, like you can't fully know everything your body and brain is sort of dealing with. You can just do your best to ride it out. And
we've compared leaving the church to leaving a codependent relationship. And that really is a great metaphor, because you know, if you've ever left a codependent relationship, you can see that it's not as easy as leaving the relationship itself, that there's a whole psychological pattern that you have to work through. So it's not just, I left the church, now all my programming's gone, I can just, you know, be me, do whatever. It's like there's still these patterns that are inbuilt, and it's a process of going through, finding out what's healthy for you. And it's okay to take time in that. You don't have to feel like, a lot of people feel rushed to have their whole life make sense, to say, oh, to adopt various labels, I'm this or this, I identify as this or that. If you're losing a huge chunk of your identity, you don't need to feel pressure to offer an explanation of what that is, or what all of you encompasses, or what you believe. You know, I thought it was so absurd when, you know, right after leaving the church, Mormons would be like, well, what do you believe in now? And I'm like, I don't know. I've never heard anything else.
It's like almost like a fallacy, or like a common thing Mormons use, is this idea that, oh, if you've left, then you have to have found something better, because otherwise why would you give all this up? And it's like operating from the assumption that it's true, when like obviously you've realized it isn't. So there's that. Another thing I was going to say is like the nature of codependency is, you know, you're like this, you're leaning on this thing to be able to stand up. So then if that thing's removed, you'll fall down at first. And you have to find a way to build yourself back up and stand on your own without needing to lean on a church or whatever. And I think we do see people who find that really intolerable, and they do run to another church. I'm not necessarily like making a judgment about whether that's good or bad. It's, you know, everyone's experience is so different, but I imagine there are some people who perhaps just feel such a need to continue being codependent that they do run to another church, and it's not necessarily a healthy, good decision.
A lot of people message us about the difficulty of dealing with family. And I feel like everything we've talked about thus far pertains to family, but family is kind of unique. It's one of those disillusioning experiences where you realize like, oh, it's all about family until you're not in the church. Then you realize it was really about obedience and conformity, not necessarily about family. And that's a really hard thing to grapple with, to feel like there's this infrastructure that you've been conditioned to trust and to value above all other things in the world, and then all of a sudden it's not there for you in the way that it was before. Not to say that you can't have beautiful, loving relationships with believing family members. I think it's totally possible. Especially, it's hard because I feel like people who leave tend to kind of have to take the high road more often, because they understand both perspectives. It's kind of like in their power to act most skillfully, whereas most Mormons don't even have the tools to begin like, you know, trying to make peace in the situation, you know?
What's tough is that obviously if you're an ex-Mormon or you're leaving the church, you've had the Mormon experience, you know all the stuff that Mormons know, you've operated from their perspective, but they've never operated from yours. And the way that the church sort of like safeguards itself from that reality is by saying, you know, spreading these narratives like people who left didn't understand the doctrine properly, or like wanted to sin, or they can't ever...
They didn't scour this tiny minutia
Yeah.
of apologetics.
They can't ever accept that you studied it and found that its truth claims were, you know, didn't hold up to scrutiny, and you don't think it's true. But on the topic of dealing with family members, there is a book I wish I had read when I first left the church. It's called Nonviolent Communication. I'll leave a link in the description box. It's an Amazon affiliate link, so we'll get a tiny percentage. If you buy it through our link, you don't have to. You can also, if you haven't done an Audible free trial, you can get one and listen to it for free. But this book is just a fantastic sort of framework for dealing with difficult conversations like the ones you'll have with Mormon family members when you're leaving. And it just shows you how to, you know, do your best to not let conversations become like these violent sort of like ego slanging matches or whatever, and kind of stay in control of yourself and not feel like swept away by your emotions of, you know, frustration and all these things that are so normal to feel.
That are definitely going to come.
Yeah, I did not practice nonviolent communication when I first left the church. I was kind of like a bulldozer, and again, forgive myself, you can only do your best at the time with what you know, but I wish someone had told me to read this book when I first left, so can't recommend this enough. I am an INTP, for anyone who cares about Myers-Briggs, so I really value kind of like formulas for doing things, and this book is a really good sort of formula for navigating difficult conversations.
Oh yeah.
It makes me feel like more sort of in control and safe when I have a formula. Humans love rules. That was another thing I wanted to mention, is that Mormonism and high demand religions, you know, they have such strict rules, and our brains actually really like rules. Mormons like to say that people leave the church because they don't like the rules or whatever, but actually most people are comforted by rules existing because it gives order to the world, which our brains love. They love finding order in the world and feeling like things make sense and like there's a framework. So it can be scary leaving the church and suddenly it's kind of this free-for-all, and you have to figure out, I mean, we've been on a big journey of like figuring out our moral code outside of leaving Mormonism, and ultimately what we've got to is that, you know, we want to reduce suffering in the world and we want to not contribute to suffering in the world, and that's kind of the perspective we operate from when determining, you know, making moral decisions or whatever. But it can be a journey, you know. It can be things like abortion, for example. You leave the church and you're like, how do I feel about abortion? Like, yeah. I have all of these deeply emotional views that have been instilled in me about it, but then also suddenly you're sort of free to look at it from a different perspective and stuff like that. It's like a journey to figure out your views and all that stuff, and my advice would be to just stay really open-minded and consume as much good information as you can, and again, like Tama said, don't be so quick to put labels on yourself or feel like you have to have everything figured out, because you don't. Yeah, or to explain yourself in any way. This comes back to family too, with as far as feeling like you have to address every question that's presented to you, or interact with certain family members who may be toxic, or at least the relationship with you is toxic, and you're under no obligation to explain yourself to anyone, to have anyone in your life who is not healthy for you. So it's okay to prioritize your safety, your mental health. Yeah. Because again, the church puts so much emphasis on familial relationships, but those relationships aren't always healthy. And so it's okay to give space between, I mean, we feel that too, you know, people are always asking us to, you know, fight so-and-so, and it's like, we're under no obligation to like do something that isn't like benefiting our personal health. Like, that's not what we want this to be about, and that's not what the leaving the church journey is. It's about finding out who you are, and like putting yourself as your priority for the first time in your life. Yeah. And it's really a process of learning to trust your own intuition, like just trusting yourself. Intuition's kind of a loaded word, because on the one hand, our intuition is very powerful. If anyone's read Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, it talks about how powerful intuition is. But then I also think sometimes people say, follow your intuition, and like a lot of people's intuition
is like, the church is true because I feel good.
Exactly, so it's kind of a tough one, but learning to trust yourself, learning to make yourself your own guru, to put yourself at the center of your life, not in a selfish way, but in a way that makes you a healthier, more whole person that is better able to help the world and, you know, do good and all that stuff. So I think this was a good like overview of what to expect. I would be so down to do more specific videos, talking about, you know, other
like
yeah,
sex.
Yeah,
and
exactly. Just
dating
more stuff about transitioning. But I think this is kind of the most important stuff to know right off the bat, which is essentially your feelings are valid. Go easy on yourself.
Give yourself room to grieve, to explore.
Yeah.
Don't feel like you have to. Again, like kind of like with the assuming labels, don't feel like you have to fall into a certain pattern.
No.
You know, people say, "Oh, you leave the church and you become this or that," you know, angry or liberal or you know, a drinker or a stoner or whatever. Like the joy of it is you getting to do what resonates, what feels right with you, and ultimately you being the best you is what's going to be best for everybody.
Yeah. And even though like none of us want to become the stereotypes that people talk about badly, you kind of just have to accept that you might. For example, I just accepted early on that you know, I am angry, and I'm angry because people are being lied to and people are being harmed by this thing. And you know, for Mormons, they're obviously seeing it from a different perspective. That's like they're angry because they're bitter and hateful, and you just have to accept that like you can't get everyone to understand your perspective. People will have false narratives about you. It might drive you crazy, but it's a good life skill to develop, because people throughout your life are gonna get incorrect perceptions about you, because most of the time the way people feel about you does say more about themselves than what it says about you. Wish I'd phrased that better. But yeah, you get the idea. So if you have any specific questions or things you want to talk about, please let us know in the comments below. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up so more people can see it. If you haven't subscribed to us yet, please do, and then also click the little notification bell so you don't miss videos.
Special thank you to our Patreon subscribers. We couldn't do any of this without you. We love you so much, and hope you all have a wonderful transition.
So fun. Love to grieve.
Listen to the sound in that mic, huh?
This is an ASMR.
As we leave the church, are you tempted to get some coffee? Here's me smoking a joint.